Starting, all attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Vaishali Jain, and I'll be your moderator today. And thank you so much for joining us here at Netcom Learning, a market leader in promoting lifelong learning, training, and talent development solutions. We're really excited to host today's webinar on 5 technology innovations that are changing the way we learn. And presenting today's topic is Vincent Supa. A little bit about Vincent. He's a global HR polymath and self-described member of Generation Flux. Using his operational experience across multiple industries spanning 3 continents, he now consults, teaches at New York University, and is an active member of HR Avant-Garde. As long as HR continues to be the gatekeepers to the jobs people want, Vincent will continue to give those around him, including those attending today's webinar, the prerequisite mindset to navigate the professional world to their advantage. Now, please bear in mind that this is an overview of a very robust topic, and we offer a collection of technical and business courses that can be tailored towards your specific requirements. So if you're interested in a further discussion, you can make an appointment with one of our learning consultants through our website at netcomlearning.com. And today's session is also being recorded, so you'll get free access to the recording in the next 24 hours via email. And so, one moment. Oops, sorry about that. Now, a little bit about Netcom Learning. Netcom Learning helps customers build innovative learning organizations by achieving a smarter workforce, adapting to change, and driving growth. And we do this with a broad category of offerings, developing customized learning plans and our global delivery capabilities. And since 1998, we've been empowering organizations with our managed learning services to help them reach optimal performance results. We also have our Chief Revenue Officer at Netcom Learning, who's going to discuss some of these values and other important things. Peter?
Yes, thanks, Vaishali. You know, Netcom Learning has a variety of offerings that we never are able to communicate the full scope. So today is a really special topic around business and leadership skills that we want to talk about. And we really hope to invite everybody out to our website after today's presentation, netcomlearning.com, to see these offerings. And if you don't mind moving to the next slide real quick, Vaishali, we have 9 practice areas at Netcom Learning, of which today's focus is out of that business and leadership focus area, that practice area. As Vaishali mentioned, we have a lot of offerings. They're very broad. We typically are doing a lot of customization to our content and our services to bring private customized delivery to our clients. In addition, at the end of today's presentation, we're going to briefly discuss our Sarter Learning platform. Sarter Learning is a platform of self-paced business skills and leadership training, of which you can learn from the leaders in the industry. So with that, I will turn it back to you, Vaishali and Vincent.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for that, Peter. Now, why should you attend this webinar? New technology has drastically changed the way we work, and employers are incorporating it frequently to more effectively engage their learners and reduce the time and costs of training. So in this webinar, we're going to share the various strands of technological innovation for the new age and what that all means for you. And now, before we get started, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of the logistics. So to start with, you have the option to adjust the window size to your liking. Simply hit the escape key and you'll find the Zoom button on the top left corner of your GoToWebinar viewer. And everyone has been muted except for our presenters. So please feel free to submit any questions you have for the presenters in the questions pane, either throughout the webinar or at the end of the webinar, and we'll be sure to go ahead and address them. There is also a PDF copy of today's slides that are in the handout section of your GoToWebinar viewer. And now I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Vincent to present today's topic. Vincent?
Thank you, Vaishali. Hello, everyone. 5 technologies and innovations that are changing the way we learn. Let's get started. Today's agenda, we'll be focusing on a couple of topics. Why training should focus on the learner, exploring new learning modalities, and then how to leverage technology for a truly blended learning experience. Then we will discuss the top 5 technology innovations, and then we will support our conclusions with research findings that support the changes we advocate. And of course, we will take questions throughout the webinar. Embracing innovation for a better learning experience. When we discuss technology and innovations, we usually focus on the way that new technology is making our lives easier. But I want you to imagine the flip side of that, because as technology has made our lives easier, our employers are demanding more of us at the same time. For example, before email, if your boss needed you in the evening, yes, he or she could contact you, but it would be a phone call, and consequently, more often than not, you were not contacted. So whereas email has made our lives easier, it has also demanded that we be more accessible more often. Now, technology applied to learning and development means that a lot of the responsibility for learning is also on the employee to figure out what he or she needs to learn to get the results that the employer wants. So while we talk about technology making our lives easier, it also causes us sometimes to overlook how technology and development could make our learning lives easier. So what we're really talking about is technology really requiring of us to be lifelong learners. Now, let's look at this slide where we're talking about notable insights. It has been proven time and time again that technology cannot fix a bad problem. I use the analogy, if we were to automate chaos, we would simply have faster chaos. So an organization needs a clear vision on how learning technology is going to help them move forward to achieve the business goals they want for that technology to be effective. So again, technology cannot fix a bad process, but it could certainly improve the results of a good process exponentially. So learning and development, regardless of technology, really does need to focus on the learner. Learners are often at the tail end of a long list of priorities when it comes to organizational learning. So when companies are bringing in new technologies for learning and development, there's heavy talk on budgets, compliance issues, who are the stakeholders, what are the reporting issues, what are the skill gaps in terms of setting a succession plan, what are the competencies that are required, and a whole array of other concerns which really put a lot of pressure on the learning function. But sometimes what we lose is putting the focus on the learner. The learner can often get forgotten and left to consume training that sometimes feels irrelevant and unrelatable. This is what we call in HR encapsulation. Encapsulation is when you learn a new skill acquisition, but that skill acquisition is not used on a day-to-day basis once you return to your office. Not only has technological solutions not always been user-friendly, but organizations have not always focused their strategies on the learners, on the employees. So in other words, a platform that has a very user-friendly interface will never make up for bad content. And by bad content, we're talking about content that is not relevant to the needs of the learner. Now, what are the needs of the learner? Well, the needs of the learner would be the skill acquisition that the organization requires for results. Because as we discussed last month, good training is results oriented. So when we don't put the emphasis on the learner, on what skills he or she needs to learn to get the results that the organization requires, ultimately leading to net income and stock price, well, this is a suboptimal approach that reduces the potential higher return on investment that good learning should have. Now, top 5 reasons for switching to a new learning technology. Well, an improved user experience is really the main reason why organizations want to switch to technology. So this sort of switches back the emphasis to the learner. Now, according to industry surveys, 83% of organizations in the study said that the ability to create an intuitive, user-centric interface was the most critical competency in choosing the next provider. What do we mean by a user-centric interface? Well, I'm going to use two common examples from day-to-day life. No one had to be trained on how to use an ATM machine. Now, you might say, well, why would you need to be trained to do that? Well, remember the old VCR machines back in the 80s? For many of us, the time kept flashing 12 o'clock because many of us had to be trained on how to set the time. So what happens is, just because something seems easy like an ATM machine does not mean that a lot of thought did not go into making sure that the training was built in the design. We might imagine setting the time on a VCR machine should be just as easy as using an ATM machine, but that's an example of training not being built into the design. So if we take training being built into design for granted, it's because it was done successfully. So many of the organizations that are considering turning to a new training development platform cite the idea of building training into design, otherwise known as a user-centric interface, as the most critical competency in making that selection. Now, when we decide what training to acquire, we always want to tie the training to a skill acquisition, and that skill acquisition should be tied into a bona fide occupational requirement. A bona fide occupational requirement is the metric that HR will document on their performance appraisal in what they're measuring the employee's performance on. So it all needs to be linked holistically, ultimately, to the performance management system, which measures metrics that ultimately either increases revenue or decreases cost to ensure higher net income. Now let's explore some new learning modalities. Now, organizations need to step outside of the classic comfort zone of the classroom and explore new and innovative learning methods. So one example of this might be gamification. Now, the classroom and the course alone inside the classroom do not comprise a complete, effective, and attractive learning experience, especially against the backdrop of blended learning. Now, blended learning is really what speaks to how we're hardwired as human beings. So if you look at digital native millennials, they will soon be the majority of the workforce. So blended learning will be combining the traditional classroom learning where training has traditionally taken place with some other platforms for learning that we will discuss. Now, another notable insight: informal peer-to-peer learning, coaching, mentoring, and what is the most common training? On-the-job training. So again, informal peer-to-peer learning, coaching, mentoring, and on-the-job training. These are considered to be nearly as effective as traditional instructor-led classroom training, but are used 65% less often. So imagine putting some formal structure and some sense of some way to institutionalize the informal peer-to-peer learning, coaching, and mentoring. Imagine formalizing that in a way that we can measure it and then combining it with traditional training. Well, this would be an example of blended learning.
Quick question.
Yes, Vaishali.
Okay. I know we were talking about all these different technologies and ways of implementing, but how do you sort of ensure that you're choosing the right technologies that sort of align with the learning culture of your organization and how people work within the organization?
Sure. I like to take inventory on what technology are people already using, because that is going to have the quickest adoption rate. So for example, when I work with clients, I'm bringing in training platforms that are on apps, because I already know that most people already use the technology of apps on a smartphone or other device. So in conclusion, let's look at the technology that's already being used, because of course that will have a lower cost because it's infrastructure we already have, and a quicker adoption rate because it's technology that users are already accustomed to.
Okay, great, thank you.
You're very welcome. So to blended learning, what is blended learning? Well, blending learning is not just about blending technology with traditional classroom learning. But there are circumstances when employees still learn best by reading online material and actual books, which again would be traditional learning. But blended learning uses many different models to optimally increase the efficiency of training while making the most of technological trends. So let's look at simulations and VR classrooms, virtual reality classrooms. They create any integrated method of learning involving both traditional, i.e. classroom learning with a traditional teacher, with modern methods, virtual reality, for example. This is what is known as blended learning. So let's think of airline pilots. How do airline pilots train? Well, first they study how their craft works. They're actually reading books and online material. And then they go into a simulator, which is virtual reality. They do not use virtual reality without studying how an airplane works, and they certainly do not only study how an airplane works in a traditional classroom environment, but they do both. This is an illustration of blended learning. Traditional classroom learning, let me learn how my airplane works. Now let me use virtual reality and a simulation to actually apply what I learned in the books. Now, blended learning comprises of several basic features. Technology-enabled learning, where only technology is used to distribute the learning material, well, that's different from blended learning, because that's an example of simply automating traditional learning. In true blended learning, technology motivates the learner to think beyond what is being taught. For example, in our pilot example, the simulation may create a situation which was not directly addressed in the textbook, but the student could take what he or she learned in the textbook to apply to a new environment being simulated in the virtual reality of a cockpit simulation. So for example, personalized simulations like the one we just illustrated, well, they provide an alternative to a real-time scenario, and it helps the trainer really avoid encapsulation, because instead of waiting until they get back to the office to see if they could use what they learned in the classroom, they actually see if they can apply it as part of the same training platform that has now been blended with traditional classroom learning. Leverage technology for a truly blended learning experience. Now, a truly blended approach involves multiple modalities that can meet the various needs of many different types of learners. So what we're talking about here is that organizations need to embrace technologies that allow them to focus on the 80% of the learning that is not formal classroom learning or traditional web-based learning. So learning strategy itself needs to recognize the existence, strengths, and values at both the informal and formal and experiential learning that the technology can be used to execute. For example, virtual reality. Now, simulations or VR create really safe environments to fail, and most learning is achieved through failure. You know, often when we succeed at something, we celebrate. But how often do we sit down and analyze why we succeeded to ensure that we could emulate that in the future? It is poignant but fundamental that we tend to spend more time analyzing our failures and learning from failures than we do from learning from our success. And simulations or VR or high-tech learning and development platforms really create those safe environments to fail where we can learn even more. Now let's realize the potential in mobile, social, and collaborative technologies. Now, in order to execute a more expansive learning experience, new technologies need to be leveraged. So there's no doubt that mobile devices, as I used in my previous example with Shali's question about using apps on iPhones for training, there's no doubt that mobile devices play an increasing integral role in how people live, work, and especially learn. I mean, I think of Duolingo and a lot of these apps that give people training and development in many different languages. So the potential for someone to have everything they need at their fingertips is a quantum leap forward towards performance support. So think about how knowledge itself has become commoditized. Now imagine the game Trivial Pursuit 25, 30 years ago before the internet. you really had to retain knowledge. Trivial Pursuit today, well, in order to really play an interesting game of Trivial Pursuit or any form of trivia, you would have to leave your iPhones away, right? Because knowledge is more accessible. But this leads us to focus not on rote memorization or the commodity or how knowledge can be commoditized, but on truly learning so we can adapt it to new experiences. So gamification would be an example, and scaffolding, for example, Duolingo, where it teaches us languages, it scaffolds lesson number 2 upon what we already learned and passed in lesson number 1.
So Vincent, you're talking about all these technologies that are now available for us to use in organizations. And you touched on this a little bit before, but can you just talk a little bit more about how to tackle some of those issues related to technology adoption among employees?
Sure. Well, some issues, look, I know it's not as interesting as talking about platforms, but budget, right? We want to consider our budget because organizations, even non-for-profit organizations, need to sustain themselves with having revenue exceed cost. So we want to look at budget. And something else one should consider in trying to figure out what technologies to adopt are the points that, Vaishali, we made in last month's webinar. What are the results that your boss needs to see? So we call this starting with the end in mind. So the end in mind might be, we need to increase revenue by 30%. Okay, that's the result that we need to achieve. So what's the content that we have to train our salespeople on? And relevant to today's webinar, what technologies or what multiple technology platforms will best optimize getting that content to the salespeople to increase revenue by 30%. So in conclusion, we want to look at what is the end result that our organization needs to achieve. And ultimately, Vaishali, that goes to net income, earnings per share, and stock price. And then we work backwards and we figure out the content that we need in the training and the best platforms to deliver it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
No, very good. Good question. So other notable insight, let's talk about the 70-20-10 model of learning. Now, for those of you that may not be familiar with this, they say that for any type of learning and development across the board, 70% is through our experiences, on-the-job training, for example. 20% of learning and development is through social interactions, and then 10% is the formal classroom training. So social and collaborative tools within learning technologies allow companies to promote and leverage the 20% of the 70-20-10 model and make collaborative learning easier, more effective, and impactful. And again, if we talk about the social aspects of the 70-20-10 rule, gamification really lends into that. If you look at the game Words with Friends, well, in one sense, it's ideal in teaching younger people how to spell, but learning Words with Friends also has a high social aspect. So it talks about gamification, the social aspect of the 70-20-10 rule, and it really teaches students how to spell words. So that might be an illustration of this concept. Now let's talk about top 5 technology innovations. Now the internet has exponentially increased our access to information. We are seeing the rise of massive open online courses, otherwise known as MOOCs, M-O-O-C. Now there were 58 million students enrolled in online courses last year alone, and these courses are now becoming more interactive and more project-based. So today's innovation, today's teaching methods using this innovation involves blended learning, which includes a mix of traditional classroom learning with online learning. So for instance, imagine students watching an online instructional video at home while classroom time is focused on problem solving and collaborative activities. Now this is something that I use in my own classrooms called the flip approach. So traditionally when I first started teaching, I would lecture in the classroom and then assign homework for when the students went home. But now I often use a flip approach where I will lecture in the students' homes. How? I will pre-record my lecture. I will put it online so the students will attend the lecture from the comfort of their home or library at home. And then in the classroom, That is when I will assign homework, when I am present, so I can directly be involved with how they perform the homework assignment. This is an example where I can ensure that there's no encapsulation, that they're able to apply what I taught them through the lecture, but I'm there on site if they had problems with the assignment. So what I just described is called a flip approach. And the flip approach also gives students control over the time, pace, and place of their learning. Because if they're watching one of my pre-recorded lectures online, right, it also enables them to go back and repeat aspects that they may not have grasped right away while spending less time on concepts that they were already familiar with.
So Vincent, that's an example of how you incorporated it into your strategy there while teaching. Now, what are some key points that leaders should consider when incorporating some of these technologies into their L&D strategies?
Sure. Well, leaders really spend a lot of time focused on externalities. What are the opportunities that the company can leverage? So there are three types of innovations. There's core innovation, adjacent innovation, and transformational innovation. So core innovation might be new and improved, right? New and improved is a very quick to market innovation that will have a slight tick in margins that will eventually settle. And then adjacent innovation really involves an innovation which might improve margins for a couple of years. And then examples of transformational innovations might be, iTunes and how Napster revolutionized the infrastructure of the delivery of music content. So I think what leaders want to do is look at their research and development budgets, see what are they budgeting in core, adjacent, and transformational innovations, and then look at what learning will be required for those three different levels of innovations. And this way your learning and development is aligned with the budget that you've already provided in your R&D budgets.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Next, we're going to talk about global online collaboration. So we are seeing an increasing focus of global online collaboration where digital tools are now used to support interaction around curriculum, objectives, and what they're actually doing is promoting intercultural understanding. I remember an online course I participated in where there were 14 different countries represented. Right, so you can imagine that the best way to learn about your own culture is when you are interacting with a different culture. If you're only involved in your own culture, that's like asking why a fish does not understand that it's in water, right? When something is so endemic, we don't always know what we're experiencing. So with global online collaboration, all of our cultural assumptions go out the window, and it forces us into a global intercultural paradigm, which of course matches our target customer base, which is the globe. Next, let's talk about the future workforce. Now, according to McKinsey, technology could automate almost 50% of the tasks people are currently paid to do. So jobs requiring higher order skills, such as creativity, emotional intelligence, and analytical thinking, well, they're always going to be more difficult to automate, and those type of jobs are likely to stick around longer. So if we look at the history of industrialization, right, in the past how many thousands of years, we had an agrarian economy that went to an industrial economy, that went to a service economy, that went into today's knowledge economy. But what happens after the knowledge economy? Well, pundits are calling it the human economy. Whereas as artificial intelligence, as algorithms consume plethoras of big data, what we're seeing is that the only jobs that cannot really be outsourced are jobs that actually require high emotional intelligence. So the future workforce is really going to center more on how people relate to each other, because much of the day-to-day work will be automated. I'll give you an illustration. In the 1970s and 80s, a secretary could support a family. He or she could support a family just performing a secretarial function. This was before voicemail and before the internet, where every manager required a secretary. Now, secretarial work focused on transactional work, but with the advent of email and voicemail, middle-level managers no longer required a secretary because the technology of voicemail and email obviated the secretarial function, where a middle-level manager was empowered to set his or her own calendar, to retrieve his or her own messages. Well, those were transactional functions that were obviated by the technology of email and voicemail. In this same way as transactional work has been obviated, tactical work is now being obviated, not by voicemail and email, but by algorithms consuming big data and to machine learning. Because most of middle-level management is really directing the flow of information between executives with external vision and worker bees, like information traffic cops. So what's happening is we're seeing tactical work now being obviated, and we're even seeing algorithms that create other algorithms when needed without human interaction. These are called master algorithms. So with much of the tactical work now being obviated, we are now seeing the advent of the human economy, and again, creativity, emotional intelligence, and analytical thinking, and when to use your intuition to take risk and counter against what big data is telling you. Those are the skills that will continue to be in demand for no other reason than they will be some of the last things, if ever, to be automated.
Hey, Vincent,
Yes.
We're just getting a question in, just taking us back a little bit. If you could repeat what you were mentioning about 70-20-10 rule earlier
Sure.
in the presentation.
The 70-20-10 rule is a model that states that learning and development happens along 3 different tiers. Okay, that 70% of the learning would be on-the-job training, experiences, okay? 20% of learning is from social interaction, and then 10% of the learning would be from formal classroom training. So it's really called the 70-20-10 model. Make sense?
Makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. So going back to 5 technology innovations, now let's talk about virtual and augmented reality. You know, augmented reality, an example of that would be, you know, Google created Google Glass, and whereas that didn't take off on a retail basis, we don't see a lot of people walking the streets, it did take on in the commercial space. So for example, engineers working on jet engines, they will wear something similar to Google Glass, and when they're looking at a part, they can call up the manual for that part on augmented reality. So augmented reality has to do with something called show me, don't tell me. So for example, when I used to write, I used to do magazine work, and my editor would tell me, don't tell me, show me. Okay, so what's happening is that show instead of telling has always been the fundamental principle in effective teaching, and virtual augmented reality is the way to accomplish that, because in virtual augmented reality, the trainer is not telling me what to do, the augmented reality is showing me what I have to do. And sometimes they could even explore what we call edge conditions. So what's an illustration of an edge condition? Well, for example, baseball players, to use the American analogy, one way to practice hitting a ball is to practice using a much smaller baseball. Or another example, in trying to learn tennis, practice using a much smaller racket. That way, when you're using a normal size racket, you have that much easier of a time into hitting the center of the racket. Now, obviously, using a smaller racket or a smaller baseball does not involve technology, but it is an augmented reality in the sense that it's not reality, but it's adding to reality by having a ball of a different size or a racket of a different size. So when you're using augmented reality, you can explore edge conditions, which even if those edge conditions would not happen on a day-to-day basis, it could help you deal with the main conditions that much better. Now let's talk about a favorite topic of mine, big data and artificial intelligence. Now data can be used to improve student results, assess student strengths and weaknesses in real time, and even create mass customized programs. Now I want you to imagine the value chain where students go in, they learn a new skill acquisition, then they apply the skill acquisition to an augmented reality, and then comparing the degree of success and failure based on the results of that augmented reality. There's an immediate feedback loop to the content at the beginning of the training value chain, where that training is now tweaked and improved until students achieve, let's say, a 99% success rate in the skill acquisition measured on the augmented reality. So algorithms can analyze student data and make programs more flexible and adapt them real time to the learner. So that's one of the most exciting uses of merging big data, artificial intelligence on training, that the training curriculum will actually be tweaked and improved real time based on skill acquisition results that can be measured safely through augmented reality. Now let's talk a little bit how technology and innovation enables this transformation. Now I'm going to start off this slide by telling you this. The human psyche needs positive reinforcement to go forward. So training not only makes employees better at their skill, but it also motivates them to perform the tasks better. It boosts morale, and it builds an element of an internal locus of control by building elements of responsibilities where they feel entrusted and empowered to do even more. Again, this is based on the premise that the human psyche needs positive reinforcement to learn the next thing. Now, technology can also transform training by offering personalized training sessions. How? Well, we touched upon this on the last slide. By quickly adapting the training content based on the level of skill acquisition that was measured through the augmented reality. So personalized training with simulations and virtual reality classes will help students learn even complex tasks safely and more easily, even allowing them to learn through edge conditions. So for example, going back to a pilot simulation example, no one ever wants a plane to crash. That is an edge condition that is frightening to anyone that's ever experienced anything remotely touching upon that. However, you do want your pilot to be trained on how to react to those edge conditions. So this is what an augmented reality can do in a simulation training cockpit. So this can help personalize training to make students better at real-time scenarios, especially in skill sets that they lack and may not be safe to test in a real condition. Now let's look at evidence where we're going to take a look at some of the effectiveness of the blended learning that we're advocating. Now Netcom Learning really integrates e-learning, high-tech learning and development platforms with traditional learning methodologies, because this is what we describe as a true blending learning experience. So Netcom Learning is going to take traditional classroom learning and it's going to blend it with AI, artificial intelligence, robotics, machine-to-machine learning. Now, organizational learning programs, right, that Netcom Learning is going to promote and advocate, well, Netcom Learning will customize these training programs to make sure that it suits clients' individual needs. Because every company has a different competitive advantage. They're competing on something slightly different from their competitors along their own value chain. So learning and development has to be customized to suit the competitive advantage that an organization wants to augment even further. So Netcom Learning will organize training sessions to make sure that it is in sync with the competitive advantages that organizations need to exploit, and also to figure out what are the results that organizations need to achieve to survive. You know, there's something called the Red Queen hypothesis. So in Alice in Wonderland, the child's storybook, Alice in Wonderland, the Red Queen complained that she had to run and run and run just to keep in place. Well, this really applies not only to evolutionary biology, but to businesses, because often companies have to constantly improve their product offerings, not just to increase their revenue, but simply to retain the current level of market share, because their competitors are improving things all the time. So in that sense, training and development really needs to be in sync with the idea of what things do companies have to do simply to continue running in place and not falling behind. So if you already have a training development infrastructure, then you already have this handled. But what we see today is that many companies are reducing their vertical integration, and a company with high vertical integration at an extreme has all of the processes in-house. They run their own payroll. They even, to use a silly extreme example, they even grow their own food for the company cafeteria. But today what we have are companies with very low vertical integration, where everything but the thing they're competing on, they're outsourcing. So if you don't have the training development infrastructure, finding the right partner will help you get a quicker time to market than developing this T&D infrastructure yourself. Now, just looking at some of the research findings to support some of the claims that we made, well, the key drivers of change in how organizations plan for and utilize technology is something I'd like to discuss now. So there are a few studies that I'm looking at here. And first, industry studies have found that about a third of companies have yet to implement any technology whatsoever. So these companies are going to be more reactive than proactive, and consequently, we don't expect these companies to necessarily thrive in the future. So other studies have shown that 43% of companies are more likely to explore new technologies if they already see training as a top priority. Now, in my experience, high-tech organizations, companies coming out of Silicon Valley, they would fit into this demographic, because they basically see training and development as really part of what they do every day, because the product life cycle is so compressed for their own high-tech product offerings. And then we have about 44% of companies are now actively considering replacing their current learning management systems, and 58% want to do so within the next year. So I think what we're seeing is, with a compressed product life cycle, organizations find themselves having to increase their agility. And how do you increase your agility? Well, you become a learning organization. That your competitive advantage is not the product offering that you're doing, but your competitive advantage is constant learning, so you remain agile, so you do have new and innovative product offerings that ensure that your Red Queen is always, at the very least, running in place. Now, blended learning programs by Netcom Learning. Well, Netcom Learning offers consultations, content, even a learning delivery platform where they will deliver the content, and they can even handle the administration and the administrative aspects of your training and development. And of course, they can allow you to access their own learning and development technology. Now, blended learning really provides the best of all types of learning, and this is the type of learning that Netcom Learning is always going to promote to the corporate world. It's definitely the right option for organizations to adopt, because with a blended learning, it takes into account that your employees all learn differently. No two employees learn exactly the same. So a blended approach allows employees to gravitate towards the type of learning that really speaks to the way that they learn. So with more than 20 years of experience in the field of corporate training, and with over 2,500 courses provided to both individual and corporate clients, well, Netcom Learning really does offer the right choice of blended learning to its partners. Why? Because it's constantly tweaked its own product offerings based on the results that they have achieved for their clients. So Netcom Learning has always been a pioneer in adopting the most modern technologies for corporate training, including personalized simulations and online training. They also have experts in artificial intelligence and virtual reality. And as we said, augmented reality really offers some of the best training to avoid training encapsulation, where you don't have to wait until after the training to figure out, are my employees able to apply what they learn? Because a virtual reality setting, you'll be able to measure the effectiveness of the training real time immediately after your employees have consumed the training. So in conclusion, some of our key takeaways. Well, organizational learning has finally begun to make a change similar to the advent of blended learning delivery formats itself. Also, millennials now make up the largest generational group in the workforce, and eventually they will now be running organizations themselves. So a lot of the blended learning really speaks to the new and creative ways that millennials learn best. Now, technology itself has enabled us to communicate and collaborate in ways we never thought possible, but remember, if you automate chaos, you simply get faster chaos. So technology will never make up for bad content, so it still is key to have the best training content available. And then with emerging technologies, blended learning has become what we think is the most effective way for corporate training. And blended learning is the perfect solution to providing the best of both worlds, where we still maintain conventional training, online courses, reading material, but we combine that with the convenience of technology-aided training, which includes virtual and augmented reality. So Vaishali, that wraps it up to me. I'm going to toss it back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Vincent. That was very informative. And if you are interested in learning from top American leaders, you can log on to our e-learning platform at sartorlearning.com. And you can use the special promotion meant for first-time users using coupon code SARTOR20 and begin your leadership journey now. Okay. Vincent, can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great.
I see the special promotion screen that you just jumped off of.
Okay, great. So just a little bit about Sartor Learning. It's a micro-learning knowledge platform that brings the world's best Fortune 500 company CXOs, Ivy League professors, best-selling authors, all together to share industry-wide best practices related to leadership and management. Sartor Learning, under 13 different categories, has a rapidly growing course library relevant across multiple domains with well-defined specific learning paths and scenario-based learning. An intuitive and responsive learning management system environment makes it easy to track one's learning journey and take courses at your convenience. So we're going to go ahead and launch a quick poll to find out more on if anyone is actually interested in taking up some additional training, and we'll get in contact with you. We also wanted to let you know that we have many more informative webinars coming up, so please feel free to log on to netcomlearning.com/webinars to register, and also please follow our social media pages to get the latest technology updates. You could see the links on our GoToWebinar chat window. So we're going to go ahead and take a couple of more questions for anybody who'd like to write in. Vincent is still here. We'll go ahead and take questions now. So Vincent, you hit on this a little bit during your webinar. Talk about budget. Now,
Well, go ahead.
Do you really need to have a big budget to do this, to incorporate learning technologies into our organization and our learning strategies?
Well, if you're going to do it all yourself and you have high vertical integration, which is not the current corporate trend, then yeah, you do need a big budget. But if you partner, if you take on vendors, for example, a company might specialize in providing the best customer service and, let's say, repairing iPhones and other devices, right? But their specialty may not be learning and development. So if you partner with the vendor, and this goes anytime you partner with a vendor, the reason why we partner with vendors is for scalability. So if you partner with the vendor, you're consuming the training that you need when you need it, and you're able to customize it to a budget and your cash flow. So, in conclusion, if you're going to develop the training development infrastructure yourself, then of course you need a bigger budget. But if you partner with vendors, then of course you could scale it to your current budget.
Can you talk a little bit more about some of the success metrics that you've seen in different types of learning technologies versus classroom training, for example?
Sure. Well, the best success metric is the one that investors care about. So when I'm on investor calls, they're talking about lagging indicators. They're talking about net income. They're talking about margin. They're talking about earnings per share. They're talking about the stock price. So ultimately, when learning and development ties into the things that shareholders care about, that technology and learning development has pretty much proven itself. Now, there are many leading indicators. For example, a learning development technology might measure customer satisfaction, and that's important. But remember, customer satisfaction does not appear on an income statement. Then you have to statistically correlate customer satisfaction to revenue, and that's something that we can do. But the best metrics are the lagging indicators that the CEO gets judged on by his or her shareholders. So if you could tie training and development to those lagging indicators, you've certainly proven its case.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have a question here. When talking about human-based jobs that will not be automated, you had mentioned, Vincent, something about high emotional intelligence, creativity, intuition, to take risks and go against data. And then there was something else that you had mentioned. Do you know what that other element was? This is what one of our listeners would like to know.
No, I mean, I thought our listener covered it all, but let me
Mm-hmm.
go over it.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the things that cannot be automated. Okay, I'll go over the list.
Mm-hmm.
Anything with high emotional intelligence, when to go against the data, using your intuition to go against the data. One thing might be that I will reiterate is in determining customer latent needs. Now, latent needs are needs that are so fundamental that the user themselves do not know that they require it. So an example of this would be if Henry Ford used big data, and let's say Henry Ford, who invented the car, let's say that he had the best machine-to-machine learning automation available. Well, based on historical data, he would have come up with horses that ran faster and or horses that required less water. So automation could never account for things that have no historical precedence. It would never account for building a horse carriage bereft of a horse itself. So another thing that can never be automated, it was creativity. That bleeds into the point that I made. You really can't automate creativity. Now, automation is great at predicting trends and improving trends, but in order to improve trends, you need historical precedents. What were the third quarter earnings to predict the fourth quarter earnings? But if you're talking about latent innovation so endemic to human needs that even humans themselves would not necessarily think of it, well, that only comes from creativity, and creativity is when you've invented or innovated something that did not exist before. So it does not matter how much historical data points big data and algorithms are consuming. It simply never existed before. So it would be creativity. That would be the point that our listener did not mention, but I believe I did mention when I discussed that in the previous slide.
Yeah. She actually did mention it, but maybe it seems like maybe she was able to cover everything.
Okay, I think she covered. I think she covered
everything.
anything. But I'll give you another example would be, Vishali. Let's look at anything that involves human interaction, like caring for a sick person. Now, despite robotics eventually being able to perform those functions, right? There's something about the human-to-human experience. Sometimes people are going to feel more comfortable ordering a big purchase item from another human being and not just from a kiosk. So anything that really speaks to the way that we're hardwired, anything that really speaks of how we judge success, and obviously a lot of that has to do with how human beings interact with each other. So things like that will probably never really be automated.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. How much, in your experience, how much classroom training is actually being administered in organizations today versus learning technologies?
Well, because it's scalable, computer-based training is really obviating a lot of traditional training, especially for basic skills. You know, for example, if you're learning something basic like, you know, Excel or how to code Python or R, those are computer languages. Well, you know, if you're doing online learning, lynda.com, Khan Academy, things like that, it's scalable. And it's more cost effective for people to deliver. Now, if you are being trained on something that involves high emotional intelligence, yes, there are online learning courses available, but that would be training that would really be best suited for a blending approach where you're combining online learning with traditional classroom learning, where you can actually interact with the live instructor. But in conclusion, online learning, simply because it's completely scalable, is beginning to replace traditional learning. So, you know, quick illustration, the marginal cost of adding an additional student for online learning is zero. All of the cost goes into their production on the front end. But every time you add, let's say, another 20 students to a classroom training, you need to secure another room and another instructor, which will cost you more money.
Right. Okay. Well, this was great. Thank you, Vincent. Do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up today's session?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say I try to make sure that I read at least 2 things that I would not normally come across reading in my day-to-day experiences. I always try to learn something new every day. And often I allow serendipity to be involved. So I always want to learn something every day, and sometimes that's just going online. And I try to learn something that I would not necessarily learn from my day-to-day interactions, something that I would not expect to learn. So I really kind of go out of my way. And I'm really going to take a page off of Russell's book, Russell Sauter, Be a Lifelong Learner. Because that's really what keeps us engaged, and that's what really helps us enjoy what we're doing, because by being a lifelong learner, Vaishali, we're outrunning lesser versions of ourselves.
Wow, that's a great tip and a great way to end today's session, Vincent. So thank you for that. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. And if you do come up with any additional questions, feel free to send them to webinar@netcomlearning.com at any time. And we hope you found today's webinar informative, and we look forward to seeing you back here with us very soon. Feel free to tell your friends and colleagues about our webinars and other courses, and everyone have a great day.